Do you mind being middle-aged?
Well, you're the first person to point it out to me that I was, and that's somewhat ungracious. Yes, I mind. I think a terrible mistake has been made somehow. And I suspect that I'm traveling in time, really. That I'm basically, I think, 21 years old, and that I've been misclassified somehow, or time has slipped.
Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five is a novel about a man named Billy Pilgrim. Billy has come unstuck in time and has the ability to travel through time to different points in his life, although he doesn't seem to be able to control this ability all the time. He's walked through a door in 1955 and come out another one in 1941. He's gone back through that door to find himself in 1963. He has seen his birth and death many times, he says, and pays random visits to all the events in between. Throughout the novel, Billy travels to his honeymoon. He travels to a plane crash he survived in 1969. He travels to the war. One night he can't sleep because he knows he'll be abducted by aliens in a matter of hours. Billy sees time as less of a universal constant and more of a spatial dimension. He is able to travel between events similarly to how you or I can travel between cities, and yet he always ends up back in 1944. It's a fairly well-known fact that Slaughterhouse-Five is a semi-autobiographical novel. Vonnegut wrote it in order to catalogue his experience as a prisoner of war during the tail end of World War II. He witnessed the Allied firebombing of the German city Dresden before he was freed, and spent many years struggling with painful memories. When he tried to write about them, he found it best to abandon the linear concept of time and write about these events in the way that he viewed them. Vonnegut also frequently uses metaphor to express the depth of his experiences, and everything in the novel is connected somehow to Vonnegut's life. As he puts it, all of this happened, more or less. Thus, we have Slaughterhouse-Five, what I believe to be one of the most powerful novels I have ever read. Slaughterhouse-Five's structure is interesting. It's a non-linear narrative, in the sense that all of the actual events are scattered across Billy Pilgrim's life, and yet, at the center of the narrative, there is an entirely linear story about Billy's time as a prisoner of war. One could think of this as a number of events that surround the central story, but I like to think of it as a jigsaw puzzle of memories being put together. Billy is remembering various aspects of the war at wildly different points of his life. Slaughterhouse-Five just puts it all together for us, the reader. After all, the novel is predominantly just a depiction of trauma and the derealization that can come with it. He gets up to go to the toilet on his honeymoon, which suddenly reminds him of when he did the same thing while being kept at a prison camp. While singing along to a Polish song with his father-in-law, he recalls seeing a Pole being publicly hanged in Dresden. The time travel part of the story is really just a metaphor for flashbacks. The novel is often funny, but almost in a tragic way. It's as if Vonnegut is using humor to help process his emotions, like when he uses Newton's third law to describe Billy having diarrhea on a prison train, ending the line with, "This can be useful in rocketry." It's a funny one-liner for sure, but it's surrounded by a sea of sorrow and nihilism. A lot of the science fiction parts are funny too, but apart from a few key takeaways, they feel like mere distractions from the bleak life of Billy, a fake utopia. The Dresden firebombing was inarguably an atrocity. The city was almost entirely populated by civilians, and it served functionally no strategic purpose to the Germans. Nonetheless, it was destroyed, in an attempt to accelerate the end of the war, according to Vonnegut. The event holds many similarities to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. Both were predominantly an attack on civilian targets in an attempt to push the Axis powers to end the war. While both fit the description of a war crime, it's easy to see that these isolated tragedies helped to prevent a lot more deaths than they actually caused. They killed hundreds of thousands, but the war had killed tens of millions. So it goes. Still, you don't need to be a Nazi to feel sympathetic for Dresden, and you don't need to be a Japanese nationalist to feel sympathetic for Hiroshima. They were civilians. Vonnegut makes the argument that all wars are fought by children. An alternate title for Slaughterhouse-Five is The Children's Crusade. He points out how most of the militaries that fought in World War II were made up almost entirely of conscripts, young men pulled right off the streets of the US. Vonnegut intentionally makes sure not to depict any of the novel's characters as heroic or overtly masculine, instead directly portraying them as immature, self-obsessed, exhausted, afraid, aimless in a world that expects them to return to normal lives after the war. These aren't caricatures of heroes, like a lot of media tends to portray soldiers. These are people. While Billy is staying at a prison camp, he runs into a group of captured British soldiers who seemingly represent what we think war should be. They have high morale, singing songs to each other every day. They trade supplies with the Germans. They have table manners and live relatively comfortable lives. This is contrasted with Billy and the American soldiers, who are unrefined in every sense of the word. Their language is crude. They get food poisoning and vomit their brains out. They keep dying day after day. So it goes. The mechanics behind Billy's time traveling are explained by the Slaughterhouse-Five, the aliens that abduct Billy in 1967. They are beings that experience a four-dimensional reality and can travel through time as if it is a physical space. They can see their birth every moment in their lives and their deaths. They can see the end of the universe, and yet they don't do anything to change any of it. To them, their lives are destiny. They don't care about death because to them, death isn't really a problem since they can just go back to a point where they were still alive. To them, worrying about death would be like me worrying about drowning in the Atlantic Ocean, or being killed in a volcanic eruption, or being slowly irradiated to death by the Chernobyl reactor. It doesn't matter, I can just stay away from all of those. The Slaughterhouse-Five frequently use the metaphor of mountains to explain the difference between a three-dimensional and four-dimensional reality. The guide invited the crowd to imagine that they were looking across a desert at a mountain range on a day that was twinkling and bright and clear. They could look at a peak, or a bird, or a cloud, at a stone right in front of them, or even down into the canyon behind them. But among them was this poor earthling, and his head was encased in a steel sphere which he could never take off. There was only one eye hole through which he could look, and welded to that eye hole was 6 feet of pipe. This was only the beginning of Billy's miseries in the metaphor. He was also strapped to a steel lattice which bolted to a flat car on rails, and there was no way he could turn his head or touch the pipe. The far end of the pipe rested on a bipod which was also bolted to the flat car. All Billy could do was see the dot at the end of the pipe. He didn't know he was on a flat car. He didn't know there was even anything peculiar about the situation. The flat car sometimes crept, sometimes went extremely fast, often stopped, went uphill, downhill, around curves, along straightaways. Whatever poor Billy saw through the pipe, he had no choice but to say to himself, "That's life." I think it's interesting that they specifically use mountains to specify the ups and downs of life, since mountains are notoriously immovable. The Slaughterhouse-Five also have a saying for death, "So it goes." It's such a passive, disinterested way of putting it, extremely similar to saying, "That's life." You can do whatever you want in life, but death is certain. That's just how it goes. Trying to challenge this, to cheat death, is a pointless exercise. And this metaphor is even more interesting when you put it into the context of Slaughterhouse-Five's main ideological point. The Dresden firebombing was brutal, but it was a necessary step to end the war. A lot of people refer to Slaughterhouse-Five as an anti-war book, but that's sort of missing the point. Even within the novel, Vonnegut compares the act of writing an anti-war book to writing an anti-glacier book. War is terrible, but it's inevitable. Trying to end war is like trying to get rid of glaciers. It's like trying to cheat death. It's just a dead end. In life, we will fight in wars, and a lot of us will die. We will have to witness brutal atrocities. We will be scarred. That's just how it goes. The events that scar us, that will leave us changed for the rest of our lives, are part of who we are, whether we like it or not. I think it should be apparent, considering how long I've rambled about it, that I heavily identify with Vonnegut's depiction of trauma in this novel. For a large portion of my life, I was taken advantage of by others, which fundamentally reshaped the way that I interact with other people. I spent a long time isolated and dealt with disassociation for the majority of my childhood. I can't say that my childhood was defined by a traumatic event, nor anything to the extent of witnessing a large-scale firebombing, but most of my being was shaped by bad memories. I struggle to remember much from my childhood, even anything from the past few years. My memories are like a disassembled jigsaw, and I am like a time traveler, occasionally warping over to one of those memories. Maybe one day I'll have the whole puzzle assembled. The Slaughterhouse-Five's mountain analogy kind of falls flat in a number of ways. For one, there's Billy, who's able to travel through time just like the Slaughterhouse-Five. And for another, there's memory. Memory allows us to virtually travel through time, even when we experience time in a linear fashion. Maybe we can't experience things again, but we can still get a hint of them. Memories are fundamental building blocks of who we are. Without them, who are we really? I think my takeaway from Slaughterhouse-Five is a deeply personal one, as almost every other analysis of it forgoes talking about trauma being manifested into physical space and time. Maybe I just understand the novel really well because of my own lived experiences. I've had that happen before. Or maybe all the other perspectives on this novel are more focused on the context surrounding it. Slaughterhouse-Five was published during the height of the Vietnam War, which is why a lot of people interpreted it as an anti-war book. After all, America was sending millions of children to die in a foreign land. Sounds very similar to the main plot of Slaughterhouse-Five, but the novel doesn't just feel like a denunciation of war in general. Like I said before, trying to write an anti-war book is like trying to write an anti-glacier book. It's a lost cause. While context is important to understanding Slaughterhouse-Five, I wouldn't say that it's the point. The point of the novel is an emotional one. It's one about revisiting painful memories. It's about humanity. It's about destiny. I have a lot of trouble pinpointing the true point of the novel, but, well, maybe that's the point too.